She used to believe that when people walked away, it was because she wasn't enough. That was the thought that kept her up most nights, staring at the ceiling, feeling the silence press against her chest. It had been almost a year since everything fell apart, but the pain still found her in quiet moments like a ghost that refused to leave. Her days were all the same now. She'd wake up, go through the motions of work, smile politely at people she didn't really want to talk to, then come home and sit by the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant promises. She used to love the city, the noise, the movement, the sense that anything could happen. But lately it just felt lonely. The faces around her blurred into one endless crowd, none of them familiar, none of them hers. She had learned to live with emptiness. It was safer that way. No expectations, no heartbreak, no disappointments. People said time healed all wounds, but whoever said that never had their heart broken in a way that made breathing hurt. One Friday evening, she decided to walk instead of taking the bus home. It was late autumn, and the air was cool with a hint of rain in the wind. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, and leaves scattered across the ground as if running away from something. She pulled her coat tighter around her and walked slower than usual, almost hoping the world would slow down with her. She passed the small park she used to visit years ago, the one with the old benches and the quiet pond that caught the light of passing cars. Something made her stop there. Maybe it was the sound of the water, or maybe she just didn't want to go home yet. The thought of sitting alone again in her apartment felt heavier than the cold air, so she sat down on the bench and just breathed. The park was nearly empty except for a few people walking their dogs and a man sitting on another bench across the path. He seemed lost in thought, staring at something invisible in front of him. He looked like someone carrying his own set of memories, the kind that weigh more than they should. She tried not to stare, but there was something about his stillness that drew her in. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or fidgeting the way most people did. He was just there, quiet, calm, almost peaceful. For a brief moment, she envied that. As she sat there, her mind drifted. She thought about how easily people disappear from our lives. One moment they're your whole world, and the next they're just a name you avoid saying out loud. She had stopped trying to explain her sadness to anyone. Most people didn't want to understand, they just wanted her to move on. She sighed and leaned back, looking up at the night sky. The clouds were thick, hiding most of the stars. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I wish I could just stop feeling for a while." A gentle voice broke the silence. "It doesn't go away when you stop feeling. It just hides until it finds you again." She froze and turned. It was the man from the other bench. He was looking at her now, a faint smile on his face, like he knew what that kind of exhaustion felt like. She blinked, slightly embarrassed. "Sorry, I didn't realize I said that out loud." He shook his head. "It's okay. Sometimes the things we say to ourselves are the ones that need to be heard." She didn't know how to respond to that. It was strange. A stranger talking to her about something so personal, yet it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt safe. He gestured toward the space beside him. "Do you want to sit here?" The bench isn't as cold as it looks. For a moment she hesitated. Normally she would have said no. But something inside her, maybe curiosity, maybe loneliness, made her stand and walk over. She sat down a short distance from him, the sound of the pond rippling softly nearby. They didn't speak for a while. The silence between them wasn't awkward, though. It felt like both were simply existing in the same quiet moment, sharing something unspoken. He finally said, "Rough day?" She let out a soft laugh, one that didn't quite sound like laughter. "Rough year," he nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know what that feels like." That sentence, unsimple as it was, felt heavier than she expected. It carried truth, understanding. They talked a little more. Not about anything deep at first, just about the weather, the city, small things. But slowly the conversation began to wander into places she hadn't visited in a long time. She found herself saying things she didn't mean to share, about how people leave, how promises fade, how hard it is to start over. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to give advice or make her feel better with empty words. He just listened. And when he did speak, his words were quiet but full of meaning. "You know," he said, "pain doesn't always mean something is wrong with you. Sometimes it's just proof that you cared more than most people do." She looked at him, caught off guard. No one had ever said something like that to her before. He smiled faintly. "Most people run from pain, but you can't really heal unless you face it. It's the hard part nobody wants to talk about. She felt a lump form in her throat. "Do you ever stop missing people?" she asked softly. He took a long breath before answering. "No, you just learn to live with the space they left behind. But sometimes, if you're lucky, new people come along who make that space feel smaller." His words stayed with her long after they stopped talking. When they finally said goodbye, it was without exchanging names. Just a quiet nod, a small smile, and a shared understanding that didn't need explanation. As she walked home, she realized she felt lighter. Not healed, not happy, but lighter. Like she had set down something heavy for the first time in months. That night, she didn't stare at the ceiling. Instead, she found herself thinking about the stranger in the park. His calm voice, his steady presence, the way he listened like he actually cared. It had been so long since someone had looked at her without expecting anything in return. The next day, her routine went on as usual. Work, the noise of the office, the same faces and the same conversations that didn't mean much. But in small moments, she caught herself remembering his words. "You can't really heal unless you face it." She wondered who he was, what his story was, what kind of pain had taught him to speak like that. By the end of the week, she found herself back at the park. She told herself it was just for a walk, a coincidence if she happened to see him again. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. He was there again, sitting on the same bench, reading a book. When he looked up and saw her, his face lit up with recognition. "You came back," he said with a quiet smile. She shrugged, pretending to sound casual. "It's a nice park," he chuckled. "It is." They talked again that day, a little longer this time. The conversation flowed easily, like two people who had known each other much longer than they had. She learned that he used to work in a different city, that he'd gone through some tough years too, and that the park had become his place to think. When she left that evening, she realized she hadn't felt that comfortable with anyone in years. Something inside her shifted again. She didn't know what this new connection meant, or where it would lead. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. It wasn't the loud, dramatic kind that sweeps you off your feet. It was quiet, gentle, like a soft light finding its way through a closed window. As she walked home, the cold air brushing against her cheeks, she smiled without realizing it. Not because everything was suddenly better, but because for the first time she believed maybe it could be. She woke up the next morning with a strange feeling she hadn't known in a long time. Warmth. Not the kind that came from sunlight or coffee, but the quiet warmth that came from being seen. It was hard to explain, but ever since that night at the park, she felt something shift inside her. Her mornings had always felt heavy, like wading through fog. But that day, she got out of bed a little faster, made her coffee, and even played a soft song on her phone. It was strange how one small encounter with a stranger could touch her so deeply. They hadn't shared names, hadn't promised to meet again. Yet something about that conversation had stayed with her. At work, the world moved as usual. Papers, emails, phone calls, faces with polite smiles. She sat at her desk, typing away, but her mind wandered back to the park. The sound of his voice, the calmness in his eyes. She couldn't remember the last time someone had listened without interrupting or trying to fix her. He hadn't tried to fill her silence. He'd simply respected it. The thought of seeing him again crossed her mind more than once that day. She tried to push it aside, but by the time evening came, her heart had already made the decision her mind was still questioning. She found herself walking toward the park again. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The pond reflected the fading light, and the air carried that crisp coolness that made her pull her coat tighter. She walked slowly, pretending she was there just for fresh air. But when she saw him sitting on the same bench, book in hand, she felt that small, unexpected spark of happiness. He looked up just as she approached and smiled like he'd been expecting her. "I was beginning to think you'd only come that one time," he said softly. She laughed, a quiet laugh that came out before she could stop it. "I didn't plan to come back. But it's peaceful here," he nodded. "It is. The city feels quieter here somehow. It's like time slows down for a while." She sat beside him just as before, a comfortable distance between them. For a few moments they didn't speak. The world around them moved. Footsteps, the sound of leaves brushing against the ground, distant chatter. But the space they shared felt untouched by it all. He closed his book and turned slightly toward her. "Rough day again?" She smiled faintly. "Not really. Just the usual. It's strange, though. I kept thinking about what you said last time, about how pain is proof that you cared." He tilted his head slightly, listening. "I used to think pain was punishment," she continued, "like I must have done something wrong to deserve it. But maybe it's not that. Maybe it's just part of being human." He smiled softly. "Exactly. Pain doesn't mean you failed. It means you tried." They talked for a long time that evening, about ordinary things, work, family, childhood memories, small details of life that people usually skip over. But with him, even the smallest topics felt meaningful. He told her about his love for books and how he used to visit the park with his sister when they were younger. She told him how she used to draw but stopped when life got too heavy. "Why'd you stop?" he asked gently. She shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe because I forgot what joy felt like. It seemed silly to draw when I couldn't even feel anything." He looked thoughtful. "Maybe you should try again. Sometimes doing what used to make us happy reminds us that it's still inside us somewhere." She didn't answer right away, but his words stayed with her. The sky grew darker, and the lamps around the park flickered to life. She noticed how the light caught the calm lines of his face. He looked peaceful, yet there was something about his eyes, something that hinted at his own hidden pain. "You sound like someone who's been through a lot," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "Everyone has a story. Mine just took longer to accept than I'd like to admit." There was something in his tone. Not sadness exactly, but a quiet strength that only comes from surviving. She wanted to ask more, but she didn't want to intrude. Instead, she said softly, "I think it's brave to still be kind after life hurts you." He looked at her for a moment, surprised by her words. Then he nodded slowly. "Kindness is the only thing that makes sense anymore." When they finally stood up to leave, the night had wrapped itself around the park. They walked side by side for a short distance before parting ways at the corner. No plans were made, no promises spoken, yet both knew they would meet again. That night she dreamed for the first time in months. Not of the past, but of something new. Laughter, sunlight, the sound of running water. When she woke up, her heart didn't feel as heavy. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became an unspoken rhythm. Some days they'd talk for hours. Other days they'd just sit quietly watching the pond or the people passing by. She started to look forward to those evenings. They became a part of her life, the one thing that felt real in a world that often felt empty. She learned more about him, how he had once lost someone he cared deeply about, how it had changed the way he saw everything. He spoke of it not with bitterness, but with a kind of acceptance that came from time and healing. "I used to think I'd never feel whole again," he said one evening. "But then I realized maybe we're not supposed to go back to who we were. Maybe we just learn to grow around the cracks." She listened, feeling his words sink into her heart. They didn't just sound true, they felt true. Her own life slowly began to change in small, quiet ways. She started drawing again, first shyly, then with growing confidence. One evening, she brought her sketchbook to the park and showed him a simple drawing of the pond and the bench. He looked at it for a long moment before smiling. "You see beauty in things people overlook." "That's rare." She felt her cheeks warm. "Maybe I'm just learning to look again." He nodded. "That's how healing starts, and when you start noticing small things again." There were nights when they shared deeper thoughts about loss, loneliness, forgiveness. She told him about the person who had left her, about how the silence afterward had nearly broken her. He didn't pity her or try to make it sound better. He just said, "You're still here." That means something. Those words stayed with her. "You're still here." It was simple, yet it felt powerful, like permission to stop blaming herself for surviving. As the days passed, she noticed the world around her more. The smell of coffee in the morning, the laughter of a child at the bus stop, the soft orange glow of sunset. It was like she was slowly waking up from a long, dark dream. One evening, after spending hours at the park, she realized how much she had begun to depend on those meetings. He had become a constant, someone who listened, understood, and reminded her that it was okay to feel again. But there was one thing she couldn't stop wondering: who he really was beyond the park. He never talked much about his present life, only about the lessons he'd learned. There was mystery in the way he spoke, like someone who carried both peace and pain in equal measure. That night, as they sat watching the water, she asked softly, "Do you ever wonder why certain people cross our paths?" He smiled without taking his eyes off the pond. "All the time. I think people come into our lives when we need them most. Sometimes they stay, sometimes they don't. But either way, they leave something behind." She looked at him, realizing she didn't want him to be one of those people who left, but she didn't say it. Some feelings were too delicate for words. When they parted that evening, something about his goodbye felt different, gentler, quieter, as if he knew something she didn't. As she walked home, the streets glowing under the streetlights, she felt both comforted and uneasy. She couldn't explain why, but a small voice inside whispered that change was coming. She didn't know yet whether it would be good or painful, only that her life was no longer standing still. And for the first time in years, that didn't scare her. The next few days passed quietly, but not in the same lonely way they once did. Her evenings had started to feel like something to look forward to, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because she felt seen again. She had spent so long moving through life like a shadow, unnoticed, invisible. Now, for the first time in what felt like years, she was being truly listened to. It wasn't about romance or promises. It was simply about connection, the kind that felt honest and rare. Every evening, she found herself walking the familiar path to the park. It wasn't planned anymore. It had become part of her, a rhythm that brought peace after long days of pretending she was fine. The man was always there before her, sitting quietly on the bench by the pond, reading or simply watching the world go by. Each time she saw him, a small smile would form on her face without her realizing it. They talked about many things, not deep, philosophical ones all the time, but simple human things that carried more truth than any speech could. They spoke about music, about the strange comfort of rain, about how people can walk past each other every day and never really see one another. One evening, when the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth after a drizzle, she asked him, "Why do you come here every day?" He smiled, looking out over the pond. "I guess it's my way of remembering that the world is still kind. When life gets too noisy, this place reminds me to breathe." She thought about his words for a long moment. "That's how it feels for me too," she said softly. "Like this place is outside of everything that hurts." He turned toward her and nodded. "Maybe that's why people like us end up here, because we need somewhere quiet enough to listen to ourselves again." His words lingered in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty, though. It was full of understanding. She noticed how his hands looked, calm, steady, but marked with the kind of stillness that only comes after long struggle. He carried himself with quiet strength, not because he had never fallen, but because he had learned how to rise again. Sometimes she wanted to ask him more, about what he had been through, what had shaped that gentleness in him, but something always stopped her. Maybe she was afraid of knowing too much. Maybe she didn't want to break the peace they had. One evening, as the sun was dipping below the trees, she said quietly, "Do you ever think people meet for a reason?" He looked at her thoughtfully. "I used to think everything was coincidence, but now, I think life has a way of crossing paths that need to cross. Maybe not forever, but for long enough to change something inside us." She smiled faintly. "Maybe we're those paths." He didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "Maybe we are." That night, when she went home, she couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. She sat by her window, sketchbook open, trying to draw what she felt. It wasn't a person, not even a place, just light and shadows. The way hope felt when it quietly returned to a heart that thought it was done hoping. When she looked at the drawing, she realized something she hadn't noticed before. She was healing. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the small, almost invisible moments that built up like whispers. She was smiling more, sleeping better, even talking to her co-workers again. It was as if the stranger had quietly stitched back the broken parts of her without even trying. But life, as always, has a way of testing what it gives. One evening, she reached the park and saw the bench empty. She waited, thinking maybe he was running late, but as the sun went down, the park lights flickered on and he still hadn't come. She told herself it was fine, that he probably had something important to do. But when it happened again the next day and the day after that, she began to feel that old ache again, the one she had just started to forget. For days she kept coming back. The pond still shimmered, The same people still walked their dogs, and the same wind rustled through the trees. But the bench, their bench, stayed empty. She sat there alone, staring at the spot where he used to sit, wondering if she had imagined it all. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe this was what he meant when he said not all people stay. Still, she couldn't let go of the thought that something was wrong. There was something about the way he had said goodbye that last night, the softness in his tone, the way his eyes had held hers for a little too long. It hadn't felt final, but it had felt heavy. One afternoon, she walked through a different part of the city just to clear her head. She found herself in front of a small cafe near the hospital, a place she had never noticed before. Through the window, she saw him. He was sitting by himself, a half-empty cup of tea in front of him, looking thinner, paler somehow. She froze, unsure what to do. 100 questions rushed through her mind, but only one mattered. Was he okay? She hesitated, then walked inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes before it turned into a quiet smile. "I didn't think I'd see you here," he said gently. "I could say the same," she replied, sitting down across from him. "You disappeared." He looked down, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to worry you. I just had some things to take care of." She waited, but he didn't elaborate. Something in his eyes told her there was more, something he wasn't saying. "You don't look well," she said softly. He laughed quietly. "I've been better." Then after a pause, he added, "I've been at the hospital nearby. Just routine stuff." The casual tone didn't fool her. There was something fragile about him now, something that made her chest tighten. "I wish you'd told me," she said. "You didn't have to go through it alone." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Some things are easier to face quietly. I didn't want you to worry." She didn't know what to say. The silence between them wasn't comfortable this time. It was heavy with unspoken things. Finally, he smiled faintly. "But I'm glad you came. You always show up when I least expect it." She smiled too, but her eyes burned. "You're the one who taught me to show up, and for people, for life." They sat together for a while, not talking much, just sharing space again. The world outside the window moved. Cars, laughter, the clinking of cups. But inside that small cafe, it felt like time had slowed again. When they finally stood to leave, he said quietly, "I'll be back at the park soon. I promise." She wanted to believe him. She really did. That night she walked home under the streetlights, her mind heavy with worry and hope tangled together. She looked up at the sky, the same one they had both looked at so many evenings, and whispered, "Please be okay." The next few days passed slowly. She went to the park again, and true to his word, he returned. He looked tired, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't dimmed. When she saw him, relief washed over her. "You kept your promise," she said, with a small smile. He nodded. "I told you, people come into our lives for a reason. Maybe mine was to remind you how strong you are." She laughed softly, though her eyes filled with tears. "And what about me? Why do you think I came into yours?" He looked at her with a warmth that went beyond words. "To remind me that kindness still matters, that even when life hurts, we can still care." The breeze rustled through the trees, carrying his words like a quiet truth between them. They sat for a long time that evening, saying little but feeling everything. It wasn't about fixing each other anymore. It was about understanding that sometimes healing happens in the company of someone who simply stays. When the night deepened, he said, almost to himself, "You know, I used to think I'd never matter to anyone again. But now, maybe I already did just by being here." She looked at him, realizing how much he had changed her life without even trying. And in that moment, she knew no matter what happened next, he would always be part of her story. The stranger who had seen her when she felt invisible, the one who had helped her find herself again. The next few weeks passed quietly, filled with moments that felt softer somehow. Each evening at the park had started to feel like a small escape from everything else, a space untouched by noise, fear, or loneliness. She began to realize how rare that was. There was something about the way the man looked at the world. He noticed things others missed. The way light moved across the pond, the way leaves trembled before falling, the way silence could hold more meaning than words. And maybe that's what drew her in so deeply. He didn't just listen. He saw. They didn't need to fill every silence. Sometimes they'd sit for long minutes without speaking, just letting the world breathe around them. And yet, those quiet moments felt more alive than any conversation she'd had in years. One evening, he arrived later than usual. The sun had almost disappeared and the air carried that cool promise of early winter. She was already on the bench, sketchbook open in her lap, lost in a drawing of the park. When she saw him walking toward her, a small wave of relief passed through her chest. "You're late," she said, half smiling. "I know," he replied softly, sitting beside her. "The doctor kept me longer than I expected." She froze for a second before she could stop herself. "Doctor?" she repeated, her tone gentle but filled with concern. He nodded. "It's nothing new," he said, forcing a small smile. "Just part of the routine now." Her heart tightened. She wanted to ask what kind of routine, what was wrong, but she stopped herself. The way he said it, with that mix of calm and avoidance, told her that pressing him would only make it harder. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. He looked at the water for a long time before answering. "Some days are better than others. Today was just a long one." She closed her sketchbook and placed it beside her. "Then maybe we just sit today," she said softly. "No talking? Just sit," he smiled, a real smile this time, and nodded. "I'd like that." They sat in silence for a long while, watching the reflection of the streetlights ripple across the pond. The stillness between them was not heavy. It was full of unspoken care, of understanding that didn't need to be explained. As the night deepened, he broke the silence first. "You know," he said softly, "you've changed a lot since the day I first saw you here." She turned to him, curious. "Changed how?" "You used to carry sadness like it was your shadow," he said. "Now it's like you've learned how to walk beside it instead of under it." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I just stopped fighting it," he nodded. "That's usually when healing begins." His words stayed with her long after she went home that night. She thought about how true they felt. She had spent so much time trying to run from her pain, pretending, hiding, building walls. But he had taught her that sometimes it's not about erasing pain. It's about learning to live gently with it. Days turned into weeks and winter arrived quietly. The trees stood bare now, their branches thin against the pale sky. The park was emptier, quieter, but the two of them still came. They brought coffee to keep warm, shared stories, and sometimes simply sat in silence while their breath turned into mist. One evening, as snow began to fall lightly, he handed her a small folded paper. "What's this?" she asked, curious. "Something I wrote," he said. "I thought you'd understand it." She unfolded it slowly. It wasn't long, just a short note written in careful handwriting. It read, "Sometimes we meet people not to stay with them forever, but to remember what it feels like to be alive again." She stared at the words for a long time, her throat tightening. When she looked up, he was already watching her, his eyes calm but filled with something deep, something that scared her because it felt like goodbye. "Why does this sound like you're leaving?" she asked softly. He smiled gently, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving, not yet, but I think you're ready to keep walking on your own even if I do someday." Her heart ached at his words. "Why do you talk like that? Like everything's temporary?" "Because everything is," he said quietly. "That's what makes it precious." She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that some things, some people, should stay. But she couldn't. Deep down she understood. The moments that change us most are often the ones we don't get to keep. The snow fell harder, settling on their coats and hair, melting slowly into the warmth of their skin. They laughed softly at the sight of it, brushing it away like children. He looked at her, his eyes soft. "You should draw this someday, the snow, the quiet, the way everything feels lighter than it should." "I will," she said. "I'll draw everything I don't want to forget." He smiled. "Then you'll never really lose anything." The next few days she noticed he was quieter. He still smiled, still listened, but there was a distance in his eyes, the kind that people carry when they're saying goodbye in their hearts long before they speak it aloud. She tried not to think about it. She drew more, worked more, filled her days with things that made her feel alive. But a quiet worry lingered in the back of her mind. Then one evening he didn't come. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, she whispered quietly, "You were right. The world still shows beautiful things if you look." The wind rustled the branches above her, scattering a few leaves across the path. For a moment it felt like a reply, a soft reminder carried through the air. She smiled, held the tiny glass bottle close to her heart, and stood up. The park lights flickered on one by one and she walked home, her steps light, her spirit calm. She had learned something she never expected. Healing doesn't always come from time or distance. Sometimes it comes from a single person who sees you, truly sees you, when you've forgotten how to see yourself. And even when they're gone, what they awaken in you never disappears. It becomes part of who you are, guiding you quietly, reminding you to live with softness, to look for peace, and to never close your heart again. That night, she placed the wooden box and letter on her bedside table. The candlelight flickered gently across the glass bottle, and for the first time in years she didn't fall asleep missing something. Instead, she fell asleep feeling full of gratitude, of quiet love, and of the memory of a stranger who had healed her heart without even trying.